I want to thank you all for coming. Let me introduce myself. My name is Father Bill Miscamble, and I teach here in the great Department of History at the University of Notre Dame. And it's wonderful to have all of our guests here on this campus at this very special conference. Last year, Professor Elizabeth Schultz of the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul delivered the inaugural John C. Jack Schuster Memorial Lecture. And I had the privilege to introduce her, and I'm grateful to David Solomon and Elizabeth Kirk for inviting me to introduce tonight's speaker. Now that the Schuster Lecture is to be delivered a second time, I think it's fair to say, in the usual Notre Dame way, that it has become an important tradition here. Jack Schuster, a dear friend of mine, died on All Saints' Day, 2005, and the timing of the Center's fall conference always occurs relatively close to his anniversary. There's something appropriate about this, I think. We remember him in a special way at prayer on his anniversary, but we also remember him and his intellectual curiosity and wide interests in this lecture named for him. I want to recognize right now the woman who makes this lecture possible as a wonderful way of recognizing her late husband's deep commitment to learning and his love for his alma mater, Notre Dame, a place from which he graduated in 1961. So I ask you to join me in thanking Mrs. Silva Schuster. Silva, would you rise to be recognized? Yes. Jack Schuster was a brilliant and thoughtful man who enjoyed success in the field of banking and investment. He was a person of great integrity and good judgment, and he tried to live his life in accord with the golden rule, and through honestly facing challenges and limitations in his own life, he came to recognize his need for God's grace, to appreciate that he couldn't do it all alone, and that he needed to trust in a greater power so as to live fully the Christian calling. He was devoted to his wife, Silva, and to their children, Nicole and John, and to his extended family. He had a gift for friendship, and as I said, I feel privileged to have been numbered among his friends. Others of them are here tonight, and they are in this row here beside Silva, and we're very grateful to have you folk with us here, a wonderful group. They have been friends in that amazing way for, well, I won't say how many decades, in case that worries Silva for me saying it, but let's say they've been friends a long time. They have been friends a long time. Great to have you all present. Jack was a generous and wise man who reached out to many others to give them support and encouragement in living well. I mentioned earlier that he loved learning. He was in his element, discussing ideas and critiquing books and arguments and engaging in dialogue and conversation. And I think he would be deeply glad that this lecture is named for him, knowing that it will be the starting point for further conversation and discussion. I think he would be especially glad that this evening's lecture will be delivered by one of the country's leading Catholic intellectuals, although one who pursues his vocation at the nation's leading Baptist university. Thomas Hibbs is currently Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Culture and Dean of the Honors College at Baylor University. After taking degrees from the University of Dallas and then his doctorate here at the University of Notre Dame, where he studied with the great Professor Ralph McInerney, Tom Hibbs taught at Boston College for 13 years, where he made his way through the academic ranks to full professor, and he served as department chair of the philosophy department. But he left the Jesuits in Massachusetts to take up the attractive offer from Baylor. Must have been something to do with the weather, eh? Or the Red Sox were having a bad season or something. In addition to teaching a variety of interdisciplinary courses, Tom Hibbs teaches in the fields of, wait for it, medieval philosophy, contemporary virtue ethics, and philosophy and popular culture. Ah, yes, popular culture. That does explain, I think, why Woody Allen is up on the screen there. It's enough to give some people a fright. Tom Hibbs has written a number of scholarly books on St. Thomas Aquinas, and a book on popular culture that has the great title, Shows About Nothing. But he's been very active lately. Two of his recent books published in 2007, Aquinas, Ethics, and the Philosophy of Religion, Metaphysics and Practice. That's exercising something of his Thomistic scholarship range. And then, wait for it, Arts of Darkness, American Noir, and the Lost Code of Redemption. Well, I'm sure that Jack Schuster would be pleased to welcome someone whose intellectual interests range from medieval philosophy to popular culture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Thomas Hibbs, who will deliver the second John C. Schuster Memorial Lecture entitled Divorce as Fracture of the Common Good, Ingmar Bergman, on Guilt, Art, and Confession. Tom Hibbs.
Thank you, Father Miss Campbell. I went to the Baptists because they were the only ones who would let me get away with this. And don't worry about this up here. We're not going from... Bergman's bad enough on a Friday night, right? Woody Allen, we're not going to Roman Polanski next, I promise. Allen's as bad as it gets. It's a great honor to be giving this lecture, and it was a great pleasure for me to meet Sylva Schuster and all of her friends who are here tonight, and I am gratified and humbled to be asked to give this lecture, and grateful for your support of this conference and of Notre Dame. The paper I'm going to give is about Ingmar Bergman, almost exclusively, except for a slight clip that you'll see momentarily. I have a few clips. I thought the idea would be to those of us who have been friends with David for many years, I think we should make an effort here. I'm making an effort to max out David's bar bill by getting you all so depressed on a Friday evening that you'll be slugging down straight the hardest stuff you can get your hands on as soon as you leave. David was one of my teachers here a few years ago, and then we had a conference. I don't know how many years ago that was now, where a festra for Ralph McInerney in this very building. And I was thinking about that night tonight, because in the audience at that, many fine people, but Tom Dillon, president of Thomas Aquinas College, who recently died last spring. Thomas Aquinas College just announced Mike McLean, who's a wonderful replacement out there. But he was in the audience, and I was able to thank him that night for giving me my first job before I went to Boston College. And a wonderful job that was. I also had occasion at Boston College to work with Arthur Madigan, who's here at this conference. And then today, that wonderful session that Robert Sloan, who's now president of Houston Baptist, gave us, a presentation that he gave us. And in the audience, David Jeffrey and Don Schmeltikoff. I had a trip to Waco, Texas from Boston to interview for the dean's position there. And my wife thought, and I thought too, I was getting it out of my system. Little did she know, I had an interview with the three of them, Robert and David and Don, that was by far the best conversation that I've ever had with any one or five persons. In this case, it was three, about Christian higher education. And it has been my great delight to work with them to advance the cause of Christian education there at Baylor. So with those thank yous, and especially to Bill Miss Campbell for the introduction, and to David for his wonderful work, and Elizabeth Kirk for all of her organizational efforts here tonight, let me get started. Ingmar Bergman's script for Liv Ullmann's 1999 film Faithless begins with a blunt stipulation. Divorce is no common failure. With one cut, it slices more deeply than life itself. The film Faithless, an extended confession of an affair that leads to divorce and much worse, is a devastating presentation of the human cost of infidelity. Not only did the characters learn Emma Bovary's lesson that adultery can be as boring as marriage, but they also experienced the dissolution of all those goods held in common by husbands and wives, parents and children. Bergman, of course, is or was a master at depicting the way things fall apart and the center fails to hold. Sometimes his characters glimpse what it might mean for a life in common to enhance rather than threaten them. As Liv Ullmann's character, Mary Ann, puts it to her now-divorced husband, Johann, at the end of Bergman's Scenes from a Marriage, at times I can read your mind, and I feel such tenderness that I almost forget myself without having to efface myself. It's a new sensation. Do you understand? However misanthropic Bergman's characters can be, they find themselves drawn to others with an admixture of noble and perverse motives. As one commentator on Bergman has written, the quest in Bergman's films, however unfulfilled, is for a certain type of communal existence. Bergman gives us dramas in which God no longer communes with human beings, and men and women find themselves inexplicably drawn to acts of mutual self-destruction. Throughout, Bergman focuses on the cinematography of the human face, which he once said has brought us the most fantastic thing that we can see in art. Among the celebrated filmmakers of the 20th century, Bergman stands out as a director with interest in raising the big questions about God, death, guilt, love, and forgiveness. 2 years now after his death, in the summer of 2007, Bergman's legacy remains a matter of dispute, with some celebrating his profound artistry and others denigrating his morose preoccupation with human misery. There's some truth to the criticisms, which is now nearly as old as Bergman's arrival on the national scene. In a 1961 piece, An Encounter, a commentator spoke of Bergman's Nordic gloom and nihilistic introversion. Bergman's work can be self-indulgently slow. His dialogue, often spoken by narcissistic male characters, can be tiresome, and his obsession with human suffering can be quite bleak. The artistry of his films, much of which is traceable to his early training in the theater, is unquestionable. Yet his enduring impact, his influence ranges from the great Polish director Krzysztof Kieślowski to well-known American directors like David Lynch and Woody Allen. Goes well beyond matters of filmmaking technique. As Brian Baxter put it in an obituary for The Guardian, Bergman astonished people with his willingness to recognize cruelty, death, and above all, the torment of doubt. Woody Allen, who tried with little success to mimic Bergman in his film Interiors, somewhat better success taking problems from Bergman in Crimes and Misdemeanors, was, I think, better at turning Bergman to common effect in films such as Love and Death in Manhattan. Here's a clip that I'm going to play right now. Woody Allen goes on there to argue that he believes that human beings ought to mate for life like pigeons and Catholics. So Diane Keaton's character there, I take it, is advancing one of those views of the heritage of Ingmar Bergman in the hall, that he belongs in the hall of the overrated. Allen, I think, is probably at his best when he's sort of spoofing Bergman. But of course, Bergman himself was not incapable of comedy. His first big critical success came with romantic comedy Smiles of a Summer Night, which won at Cannes in 1956, a surprise victory. Bergman wasn't even there. That made it possible for him to make The Seventh Seal, the film for which he's perhaps best known. He also made, a few years later, a horror film called The Hour of the Wolf, a religious parable called The Virgin Spring, and an astonishing version of Mozart's Magic Flute. As Allen, who in interviews has praised Bergman for raising existential and religious questions, has noted, Bergman's investigation of the big questions involves a degree of seriousness about serious matters that is increasingly rare in our time and especially in our art. Even after he allegedly gave up the question of God after that famous Faith trilogy in the early 60s, and he has said that at a certain point the issue of God simply dissolved for him. But even after he claimed to have given it up, he remained preoccupied with questions of guilt, particularly guilt over infidelity, with the obstacles to self-knowledge and truthful speech, and with the human yearning for reconciliation through confession. In an era in which religion is often reduced to billboard slogans or the cliches of self-help manuals, Bergman's gravity is a salutary counter. Now, the very raising of a theological interpretation of Bergman's films made him nervous. In an interview some years ago, Bergman responded to what an interviewer termed Catholic interpretations of his films by noting that he was initially not well received by the church. But later, Bergman said, they had the clever idea of co-opting him. Someone got up the idea to take him into the business, he said. Bergman went on to lament the fact that he had been plagued with Catholic interpretations ever since. And he's no longer here to object, so I'm going to add another one. Now, Bergman brings much of this, maybe not the specifically Catholic approach to his films, but he brings much of this theological interpretation upon himself. He once stated quite directly, art lost its basic creative drive the moment it was separated from worship. He also regularly liked to associate his understanding of his own craft with the anonymous craftsmen of the great medieval cathedrals. And a not unreasonable interpretation, how's that for hedging my bets? A not unreasonable interpretation of certain types of silence in Bergman's films is as an illustration of Nietzsche's pithy claim that we haven't rid ourselves of God because we have been able to rid ourselves of grammar. Insofar as language still provides a means of communication between individuals about a common world, we quite naturally assume some sort of transcendent basis for such intelligibility and communication. In her famous essay on Bergman's film Persona, Susan Sontag wrote about the continuity of language operating as a bridge over the abyss of the loss of personality. And it is precisely that continuity which is broken in many of Bergman's films, perhaps most notably in Persona. But Sontag fails to see that the loss of the continuity, the discontinuity of language, might signify something more than nihilism, that it might testify to an absence, to the human loss of God in the midst of the ongoing yearning for community. As one of the characters in Persona put it quite directly, our anxiety, our terror, and our terrified silence is rooted in a loss of faith. On two issues at least, it seems to me, Bergman remains an educator for us: confession and the role of art and artifice. Even as the practice of religious confession has declined in our nation and across the world, the public act of confession has increased. We demand it of juiced athletes and wayward politicians, but we do not limit the practice of public confession to the elite. From Jerry Springer and Dr. Phil to the high priestess of American popular culture herself, Oprah. TV hosts invite the most ordinary citizens to reveal the most intimate and sometimes the most tawdry details of their lives to an anonymous public. Critics occasionally object to the alleged amoralism or immoralism of these shows, but in fact, they often contain a great deal of heavy-handed moralizing. The real problem, I would suggest, is the detachment often presupposed in the audience. That is, after all, what allows us to find episodes of Jerry Springer entertaining, if we do find them entertaining. Even where there is not comfortable detachment, Oprah, for example, certainly strives to cultivate in her viewers deep sympathetic attachment to herself and her guests. There is a dubious assumption about the ease with which intimacy can be achieved and truthful confession performed. Bergman, by contrast, underscores the difficulty of establishing intimacy between two individuals, let alone millions. He also unveils the discomfort, even the horror, that the prospect of intimacy can provoke. In Bergman's so-called chamber plays, in which scenes of two characters in dialogue dominate, Bergman highlights the language spoken soul to soul. In such a context, silence is as important as speech, and the face itself becomes a vehicle of expression. Bergman sought to capture the wordless silence, as he put it, that only cinema can discern. His penchant for close-up shots underscores the inscrutable materiality of the face, while the intimacy of looking forces the viewer back upon himself through a realization of his own longing for communication and belonging. Now, this longing is intermixed with multiple fears: the fear of exposure, the fear of being misunderstood, or what is worse, the fear of being understood and thus rendered vulnerable to the malicious response of others. The attention of others in Bergman's films is always a threat, and in many cases, a potentially deadly threat. The danger of indifference is not as great as the prospect of an attention that would swallow one person up in the other. Hence the prominence of vampire-like characters in Bergman's films, characters who suck or bleed the life out of others. Bergman uses numerous artistic devices to portray the conflicting aspirations of the human soul. As with many European filmmakers of the last century, he is quite self-conscious about his own artistry. Indeed, such self-consciousness seems obligatory in those who aspire to artistic greatness in the last 100 years. But Bergman's self-conscious artistry and his attention to the horror of human life conducted in the absence of any clear framework for meaning have led many to classify him as an arch-modernist. Persona, for example, is typically cited as an exemplary modernist film. In his recent voluminous study of modernism, The Lure of Heresy, Peter Gay mentions Bergman only in passing. But what he has to say about modernism is standard fare. Gay's list of constituent characteristics of modernism include a penchant for heterodoxy, a principled self-scrutiny, and an insistence upon the divide between high and low art. In Gay's hands, these characteristics, sadly, end up almost as cliches. Although at one point Gay acknowledges that the modernist protest against current conditions also expresses, or at least can express, spiritual hunger, he does not see how the putting into question of conventional dogmas can open up the possibility of a fresh formulation of philosophical and theological questions. In Bergman's case, the diagnosis of modern malaise opens to a quest that doesn't ever really reach answers in Bergman, but it clarifies the questions. As Paisley Livingston, a philosopher, has commented, the desire for alternatives motivates even Bergman's darkest moments. As for the tension between high and low art, certainly Bergman's films are demanding and not exactly what we would call entertainment. But Bergman was also worried about cutting himself off from a wide public audience, the cost of which he thought was to become merely an academic filmmaker. Where film is self-reflective in Bergman, the intent is to do more than merely to call attention to the medium. He does not express distaste for ordinary life. Instead, his characters are often quite ordinary, and we're invited to find them endlessly fascinating. Self-scrutiny for Bergman always aims at a truthful account of things, even if that account never gets beyond a truthful account of why it's so difficult to offer a truthful account. Bergman did not reject the notion of art as a mirror, but he did insist that it had to be a reflective mirror, aware of concealed depths and distorting fields of vision. In our culture, we lack not only a language through art concerning confession, but we also lack a supple language for speaking about art and construction. We sense and often fear that much of what we experience is not real or natural, but artificial. We're inundated by political spin, advertising images, and reality shows that we know are not really real. We have a kind of romantic longing for the natural as that untouched by human beings, and for the unscripted, in short, the authentic. Paradoxically, perhaps, although not for Bergman, We look to art, to film, TV, literature, etc., in our quest for what is really real. Bergman doesn't supply quick answers on the relationship of art to life, but he articulates the questions and the difficulty we have in formulating answers in sophisticated ways. He also unveils, I think, for us how much our academic talk about deconstructing texts and relativistic morality is just that, academic and theoretical. A deconstructed life, many of which are on view in Bergman's films, is a pathological life, a life fractured and torn in horrifying ways. Bergman's persistent turning to the big questions means that he is a resource for philosophy, as two recent books on his films by philosophers can attest. As for Bergman's relevance to theology, I think we might recall T.S. Eliot's remark that the religious mind works by negation. Strictly speaking, that claim, that the religious mind works by negation, seems to me has to be false. The religious mind is fundamentally an affirmative mind, an intellect that cries out credo or amen. But then Eliot, who was commenting on Pascal here, was not referring to the lives of saints or the great classical theologians, but of the most effective theological approaches to the unbelieving intellect of modern humanity. The wavering, skeptical, and often self-tormented modern mind, in its movement toward religion, may well be characterized by negation, by the exclusion of alternatives. As Walker Percy once rather flippantly put it in response to the question why he was a Catholic, what else is there? Bergman does not so much show us what is to be affirmed or the path toward redemption as he demonstrates the devastating effects of the absence of forgiveness and communicates acutely the sense of the loss of God. Long after, and here I do want to turn to these two final films, one of which he wrote the script for and then the last one he directed, long after he purportedly gave up on the God question, in these two last films, in Faithless and in Saraband, religious language and imagery figure prominently. Ullman's Faithless, based on a Bergman script, is an artistically rich and emotionally devastating investigation of the human costs, especially for children, of adultery and divorce. Monstrous behavior toward children lurks not only in the designs of the lonely predator, but also and more commonly in the hearts of seemingly well-intentioned parents. As befits a world in which adult fantasies and petty jealousies supersede the needs of children, the young girl, whom I'll get to in a moment, in the film barely appears. But the few scenes in which she is featured are remarkably powerful. Bergman here deploys his craft to explore the connection in this film between art and life, to excavate the past in search of self-knowledge. This desire, often as much a perverse form of self-laceration as a hope for justice, involves at some level an attempt to see one's life more truthfully and to face more directly those whom one has harmed. Struck in working on this film again, there are similarities and striking differences between this film on the issue of truthfulness and confession and the Oscar-nominated film Atonement from 2007. The very shape of the film Faithless raises questions about the possibility and purpose of confession. In the opening, a character named Bergman, one of his famous stars, Erland Josephson, sits in the study of his home on a coastal town, that's where Bergman lived. As he sits at his desk, he conjures up an actress who takes the name Marianne to help him work through his latest script. Prompted by Bergman, Marianne relates the story of her affair with David, a divorce director and close friend of her husband, Marcus, an internationally renowned orchestra conductor and father of their 9-year-old daughter, Isabel. So we have the marriage of Marcus and Marianne and their daughter, Isabel, broken up gradually by Marianne's affair with David. Very few characters. He's like a Russian novelist in his exploring of the depths of the psyche, but he is not like a Russian novelist in his list of characters. We can keep track in Bergman. In various ways and at various points in the film, it's made clear that the actress Marianne is identical to the Marianne of the script, and that Bergman himself is an older version of David, who had the affair with Marianne. While Marcus, Marianne's husband, is away, David makes one of his regular visits with Marianne and Isabel. When late in the evening he proposes sex to Marianne, she laughs and dismisses the idea as folly. Yet the suggestion takes root, and Marianne soon begins to plan an adulterous liaison in Paris. When David hesitates, Marianne shrugs him off, saying the affair could be simple and fun. Life need not be a series of disasters, unless you're in a Bergman film. She could not be more wrong. David is a self-absorbed, self-pitying, and even when he is playful or charming, he is inevitably self-serving. Eventually, his violent jealousy, predictably followed by bouts of remorse, comes to dominate the relationship. As they, and this is Marianne's word, sink deeper into the abyss, Marianne likens her life to a dream where what we fear most happens over and over again. Void of affection and pleasure, she and David share what she calls a friendship in damnation. The low point for her occurs when, in the midst of a bitter custody battle, her husband, Marcus, calls to suggest they work things out, and when they meet, he suggests a sexual tryst with her and says, if you comply, I'll give you custody. Then she spends the evening with him, shaken, returns to David, reluctant to tell him what has occurred. His jealousy peaked, David becomes enraged and spends the entire night interrogating Marianne, forcing her to confess everything. Here, confession is forced, unwelcome, and at the service of the prurient and the cruel desires of David. Revelation here involves humiliation and the subjection of the confessor to the vampiric desires of another who sucks the life out of her. Pregnant with David's child, Marianne soon opts for an abortion and the two part. The physical and verbal abuse of Marianne is not, however, the most heart-wrenching sequence in the film. The film pivots on the scene where Marcus confronts David and Marianne, a scene Marianne retrospectively describes as the beginning of the tragedy. But the tragedy actually begins in the next scene, when Marianne must tell her daughter Isabel that she's leaving her and her father to live with David. Informed that she will have to stay with her grandmother, Isabel plaintively asks why she can't come live with David. Marianne sobs convulsively as she recalls the conflict within her. Wishing to embrace and assure her daughter they'll always be together, what she actually says is, there's no room. Marianne's internal sundering over the harm she knows she's doing is subtly intimated in the movie's most exquisitely filmed scene. The audience sees Marianne doubled, both Marianne and her reflection in a mirror. Then Isabel appears, the daughter, reflected in the mirror and seen from the audience's perspective between the two images of Marianne. As is true of this scene, the daughter appears in the film mostly in the background, typically alone in her bedroom where she overhears the arguments of adults. Her role is scripted to reinforce her status as an innocent victim. Music from a child's music box, now in Bergman's possession, begins and ends the film. The questions raised in the film are not as explicitly religious, certainly, as the questions posed, say, by Bergman's great early film, The Seventh Seal. There the knight wonders about the silence of God and describes his own faith as an activity of loving someone who never answers. Here, the questions are more about the inhumanity and indifference of husbands and wives to one another and to their children. But the title, Faithless, is striking. Why faithless? Why does infidelity matter so much? Why should anyone be plagued with guilt over past misdeeds, over harms caused? Why be burdened with the need to confess? Why the insatiable desire to get the story right and the need for forgiveness? And what are we to make of the ambiguous status of art in this film? Its ability, it seems, to help us face, as I'll show in a scene in a moment, the past, but its inability to effect reconciliation or even salutary repentance. Despite his claim that after the 1960s he simply dropped the religious issue, Bergman continues to be preoccupied with religious questions, or at least almost with religious questions, throughout his career. Most of this film, as I've mentioned, is Marianne's own narrative, her confession. She says that every day is wrong and that she's lost the ability to make rational decisions. She is also brutally honest about the self-destructive character of jealousy, about envy as a middle term between lust and rage. Under the sway of vice, freedom becomes an illusion and pleasure vanishes. Here as elsewhere, Bergman confirms Truffaut's observation that no one draws so close to the human face as Bergman. In many of his films, there's nothing more than mouths talking, ears listening, eyes expressing curiosity, hunger, panic. The impact of the parental misdeeds on the child is brought out in this terrifying scene, which I'm going to play in a moment, in which Isabel, alone in her room, relates to one of her dolls a nightmare. And notice the color on the wall here, and then notice the bed sheets here. This is Marianne with her lover David, and then it'll shift to Isabel. Here, Bergman's attention to children has little in common with our modern romantic celebration of childhood. Hollywood films today increasingly present divorce as a norm and suggest that overcoming its effects is for the most part a matter of liberating the creative impulses of children. Bergman's insistence on multi-generational conflict and on the way the sins of the parents are visited upon the next generation is more akin to the Old Testament and the novels of Dostoevsky. If there's a weakness to Bergman's portrayal of family dissolution, it has to do with his reversal of Tolstoy's dictum in the opening of Anna Karenina, that all happy families are alike, every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. In Bergman's films, all unhappy families are unhappy in the same way, through infidelity, jealousy, and vengeful rage. If this renders Bergman's treatment of the family rather repetitive, it also allows him to offer a diagnosis of some of the peculiar afflictions of the modern psyche. A theme prominent in Bergman, and again reminiscent of Dostoevsky, is that of laceration, the irrational habit of self-imposed suffering. A perverse form of asceticism, laceration mimics self-sacrifice and repentance, even as it turns violence inward. Instead of freeing one for others, laceration keeps one trapped in oneself. This is the self-destructive grief in which Marianne finds herself ensnared. In Bergman's films, adult characters, who often describe themselves, even in his late films, as undergoing a kind of damnation, vacillate between the active pursuit of pleasure and the retreat to paralyzing regret. This is but one of many illustrations in Bergman's films of his belief, this is sort of a remarkable statement on his part, in the existence of a virulent evil caused not by the environment or heredity. Call it, he says at one point, original sin or whatever you want. Anyway, it is an active evil. At various points in Faithless, Marianne weeps, as does the Bergman David character, alone with his remorse near the end of the film. The best art, I'm going to play this clip in a moment, can do is to attempt to give shape to the chaos, to articulate the desire for meaning, and since redemption is not at hand, to gain some consolation from the activity of articulating pain, loss, and regret. The scene I'm going to play now is the scene that follows the one I described earlier, where Marianne is describing her night of horror with her husband and her adulterous lover. And then this turns to David's own, let's see if I can find this here. There it is, right there. Nope. Can't get it to go up. There it is. Okay. This is the David character, suddenly appears not in the past that's being recollected, but in the present, sitting across the table, sitting directly across from Bergman, the scriptwriter. Very powerful scene of Bergman coming face to face with his younger self, and then with Marianne, whom he has harmed. The silence there, I think, is quite remarkable. But the film never gets any resolution other than that moment of recognition. Bergman's films focus, as this one does, on these questions of infidelity, guilt, confession, and the hoped-for but never realized possibility of reconciliation. A more precise way, I think, to formulate the theological problem in Bergman is to say It's a common opinion among critics that by focusing, and perhaps Diane Keaton, by focusing upon the absence of God, Bergman's early films exemplified a crisis of religious belief in the modern world. But that, it seems to me, is not quite accurate. His films often illustrate the presence, especially his early films, of a certain sort of God, an intimidating, scolding, authoritarian God, who manifests himself not in wisdom and beauty, but in arbitrary acts of will. Recall the violent spider god from Through a Glass Darkly. Perhaps this is what Bergman had in mind when he spoke of this strange thing I have called God. But I wonder whether that conception of God that he has, especially in his early films, is strange enough. For it's an all too familiar conception of a paternal authority, a God made in the image and likeness of the distant, insecure, power-hungry father figures that populate so many of Bergman's own films. A God with whom love and communion is neither possible nor desirable. And I'm moving toward the conclusion here. In light of that conception of God, which does seem to me, it's not the only conception, but it's the dominant one through most of Bergman's work as a filmmaker, there are a couple scenes that strike me as quite remarkable from his last film, Sarabande. Once again, very few characters. This film is a sort of sequel to Scenes from a Marriage, and it begins and ends with Mary Ann. This is a different Mary Ann. He's got a lot of Mary Anns in these films. This one's Liv Ullmann as the actress, holding family photographs and directly addressing the audience. At the outset, pictures of her life with her former husband, Johann, prompt her to plan a visit to see him after many years of estrangement. We learn early on that they had 2 daughters together, one of whom, Martha, has drifted into a catatonic state. She suffers from an illness that requires institutionalization. That becomes very important at the end of the film. Johann now lives near his son, Henrik, by another marriage, and Henrik's daughter, Karin, both of whom are gifted musicians. Henrik, Karin, and even Johann remain in mourning over the recent death of Henrik's wife, Anna, who is described as a pure and loving person and whose photograph throughout the film is treated with almost iconic reverence. Johann and Henrik, father and son, despise one another and exhibit the cold, remote traits common among Bergman's male characters. After her arrival, Mary Ann finds herself in the middle of tensions between Johann and Henrik, but also between Henrik and his daughter, Karin. At one point, Mary Ann enters a small church where Henrik is playing Bach's St. John's Passion on the organ. The music, we should note, is being played in the setting for which it was intended. He soon finishes and joins Mary Ann, and they have a conversation that starts out in a friendly enough fashion, but soon turns hostile as Henrik vilifies his father, Johann. I want to show this here in a second. Mary Ann, as you'll see, offers some sort of defense of Johann, and then finds herself alone in the church. This clip. Here it is. This is Henrik here, the son of Johann, and you will see Liv Ullmann in just a moment. That's a remarkable scene. Notice the way Mary Ann stops and turns just as the light comes rushing through the window. Notice how she concentrates her attention on the tableau of the Last Supper, at the center of which the beloved disciple reclining upon Jesus. Notice the way she makes a gesture of prayer. Here, I would suggest, is precisely the note of divine love and communion that is so often absent from so many of Bergman's films. It also seems to move beyond, faith does, that is, in this scene, beyond what Bergman described as his own conflict between his childhood piety and the harsh rationalism of adult life. Mary Ann's prayers, or what we guess are her prayers at this point, her intention to bring reconciliation between family members, are not answered. In the epilogue, as she again peruses photographs, she says she strives to stay in contact with Johann, but that he gradually quit responding. We might say that Johann slips away just as the way her daughter Martha is described as doing. When I first saw that scene, this is, if you write on philosophy and film, you make weird connections, but when I first saw that scene, I thought, McIntyre's Dependent Rational Animals. That's what that scene made me think about. The theme of isolation and absence are prominent in this film as in all of other Bergman films. But here, the retreat to the margins of the human community seem to have very complex sources. It's clear that the daughter, Martha, suffers an extreme form of what all human beings suffer to varying degrees, and what we all potentially suffer at any moment. There's the McIntyre language. Our apprehension, however cloudy, of this possibility is a primary source of fear and anxiety. Indeed, in this film, the two most important characters are never present. Anna, the beloved and deceased mother and wife, whose picture Marianne is holding there before she goes to see her own daughter, exercises an influence over all the other characters. Reflecting on Anna's love, Marianne is prompted to visit the other absent character, her daughter Martha, whose face she touches for the first time, she says. In their wordless silence, there is an intimation of love and communion, a replay, you might say, or a particular embodiment of the love and communion that Marianne acknowledges in the chapel. There's rich material here, I think, for rethinking the notion of disability in a theological light. And here we see once again that the human face is an icon of personhood in Bergman. We also see the body's role in the search for moral and spiritual redemption. Marianne's new opportunity at the end might be an opportunity for us to rethink God in Bergman by noticing how Bergman himself may have been rethinking the divine in his very last film. At one point, Johann sits alone reading Kierkegaard's Either Or. Kierkegaard's tripartite visions of ways of life, aesthetic, ethical, and religious, here reduced to two, the aesthetic and the religious, even if that is not as well defined here as in Kierkegaard. Johann, it seems, has opted to remain a jaded, isolated aesthete, while Marianne has taken another course, that of active love of another. It's possible here that the silence of God could become God's silence, that the anguish could be seen not primarily as a result of the non-existence of God, but rather as an integral part of the knowledge of God. Thank you. Double.
My wife knows that I suffer from the inability to express myself. She's been sending me to an assertiveness training seminar. I very much enjoyed the presentation, and it moved me to reflect on the perverse harvest of Anselm's view of retributive justice in the redemption, and this deep notion of the perversity of the idea of temporal punishment due to sin. I mean, thinking about how forgiving the God of the Old Testament is in the 50th Psalm. David, who's a murderer and an adulterer, recites, "Against thee, O Lord, alone I have sinned and done this evil in thy sight," and he's forgiven. And how really different this approach is in Anselm. It is totally different from the God of the Old Testament, totally different from the God of the first 1,000 years of Christianity. It's a moroseness that's striking. I wonder what your thoughts.
Are you suggesting an influence on Bergman?
Absolutely, sure.
Well, I mean, we could talk about I'd be happy to come back sometime and give a paper on Anselm. I think that's wrong on Anselm. I think if you read that text of Anselm in light of others, especially his prayers and meditations, that this, you're sort of giving a kind of Bergman-esque reading of Anselm. I think he ends up being much.
I mean, the idea there's a strength in traditional Christianity that all sins are forgiven and forgiven absolutely.
Okay. I'll accept that.
And David in the 50th Psalm, a murderer and an adulterer, is fine. He confesses his sin before Nathan the prophet and then recites, "Against thee alone," I mean, no guilt against others, "have I sinned and done this evil in thy sight." How radically different that is from what's presented here.
Well, I think as I said, I do think that Bergman's conception of God is typically that conception of God as the invasive, horrifying spider, right? The vengeful sort of father figure from whom one wants to flee rather than seek communion. It does strike me in this last film, particularly that scene in the chapel, which I think frames the rest of what goes on with Marianne and the other characters in the rest of the film, is a different sort of emphasis. It's not entirely absent in earlier films. I mean, you can find it in the meal that the knight shares in The Seventh Seal with the peasant actors. You can find it in some other places in Bergman, but it's not prominent. What does strike me in the other film, Faithless, where forgiveness is clearly not present at all, and there's just this sort of unending torture of facing the fact of one's own misdeeds and their harm to others, is that Bergman continues to take these things seriously. I mean, he continues to take something like sin seriously. He continues to take the necessity of confession and facing one's own past seriously, the difficulties of speaking truthfully about one's own misdeeds. And I think in that film, art takes us a long way toward reaching truthful self-knowledge. It's just that art shows us no path to reconciliation or to forgiveness. Yeah.
Thanks, Professor Hibbs. My question is, you've seen the films, and I haven't, so I want to ask you what you think about the facial expressions in two of the key scenes. The one scene where Marianne is, attempting to pray in the chapel, and then the scene where she's visiting her daughter. Her daughter comes out of catatonia.
Yep.
She seems to have a very odd half smile.
Uh-huh.
So, what do you think about that half smile, and then the almost perplexed expression on her face in the chapel?
What do you mean by the perplexed expression on her face in the chapel? After
She brings her hands down.
Yes, but like this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of that. I mean, it does seem to me that the camera focuses, and we're led to believe her eyes are focusing on that Last Supper scene, right? So I take it there that what she is praying for, and you've got the light coming in too, right? You've got this light streaming in, a sort of revelation from outside, not just from within. So it's not merely, symbolically, I'd have to read that as something that's not merely immanent within the frame of this action. So I take her perplexity there perhaps to be a question as to what she can do to bring this about. And she does spend the rest of the film trying to do that. But as I say, and I've already given enough bleak endings to stories here tonight. It doesn't end well for a number of the characters whom she is involved with. But then, this film, unlike many other Bergman films, doesn't just leave it at that. So that in the epilogue, she says, well, what could this love of Anna, who was here and so affected people, what could that have meant? And she says, well, maybe this is what it meant for me. Maybe it meant that I should imitate her act of love with respect to my own daughter. And I take it that moment with the daughter is her daughter coming out of her state, momentarily at least, and being surprised to see her own mother there, to the extent that she recognizes her. And that's how I read that final scene. And that, as many commentators whom I quoted here have said, Bergman is just a master at the human face as an acting device, right? The human face as equal in importance to human speech. And our contemporary filmmaking is pretty far from that. I mean, it's a remarkable thing to sit in a room, if you can get past the bleakness, and just watch the faces and learn from the silences of these faces. It's really quite astonishing, I think. And in this case, the astonishment and wonder is also theological.
I was very grateful for your presentation because I very rarely go to movies. And I have never seen a Bergman movie, so this is a world which is probably much more strange for me than for all of you who are more part of a visual culture. What I was struck by is I know, of course, how theologians of various Christianities, especially in Europe, which is my home, how they write about the relationship of man to God. And it is the typical thing is that there is a very, very indirect reference. And everything you showed us and everything you talked about was really an illustration of that which I know from written works of theologians, that there is a gesturing and there is a hinting and a making an opening with the hope that that opening is not just a black spot with a closed door, but hopefully something open where some fresh air comes in from some kind of transcendence. But it is really, in a way, horrifying that the yearning for transcendence like what the legacy of Levinas, for example, that he bequeathed to us, to our culture, that you look for God in the face of the other. Bergman is such a wonderful illustration of how desperate that is. I mean, the joy of turning in repentance to God and to experience what a wonderful thing it is to cry in repentance and to experience that joy and then to turn around and start one's life again, and with that joy, which is a gift, that is all lost. And so I couldn't stay silent. I think we cannot just stay with something like that. That's not what we are.
No, and that was not my intent at all. Bergman's not a believer. I'm not presenting him, even in this final film, as someone who does anything, but there he does seem to hint in the way you're suggesting in the scene in the chapel. It strikes me that and here I guess I'm resorting to taking Bergman into the business, as he accused Catholics of doing. What Bergman does in his other films, it seems to me, is to show us what a godless universe looks like. It's not, so the Bergman is not there attempting, in fact, he's attempting in some sense to do the opposite. He's arguing, if he's arguing at all in those films, through Faithless in a way, he's arguing about the absence of God, right? And in a world where, this is only part of a picture, of course, but in a world where we seem unconcerned with divorce, infidelity, the harms that parents do to children, in a world where these things are treated in our artistic culture as things that either ought to be celebrated or shrugged off as unimportant and trivial, it seems to me in that kind of world, which is our world, Bergman is a remarkably salutary corrective because of the gravity with which he continues to take the question. But I'm not saying that Bergman there is a theologian or that he's attempting to move people to theology there, but simply that the asking of the question, the pain at the absence of answers and at the absence of reconciliation in a world without God, can do more than the kind of Christianity that's often on display in our culture, that a kind of gospel of success would be one version of that, but a view of the gospel that entirely skips everything from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday and turns Jesus into the buddy Jesus of George Carlin in the film Dogma, who's winking at us and going like this. Give me Bergman rather than that as a way of starting the conversation. Now you might say, well, that's not much, but there's a certain level of seriousness about serious matters.
But it is precisely that which is left of Christianity in the theological literature with which I deal.
Well, I think you may well be right about that. I'm not saying that theologians ought to look to Bergman for answers. I certainly would not be saying that, although some of them would move a step up if they were to use Bergman. There's no question about that.
No, he just illustrates what is left of a lot of theology.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. I think that's right. Yeah, and I think this can help certain people who are not articulate about theological questions to ask themselves questions that might lead to theology. But I wouldn't want theologians looking to this. I mean, we got a lot better stuff than that.
I wonder if the expression of Bergman in his art is an expression of the sin against the Holy Spirit, where people cannot let go of despair, where despair becomes its own prurient attractiveness, and it's the last embrace of the nothingness of being without God.
That's a good question. See, I think that, and that's what I was trying to get at with the reference to Dostoevsky and laceration. It does seem to me that Bergman's characters, and perhaps Bergman himself to some extent, are engaging in this kind of laceration that makes it impossible to free oneself from oneself. That is a turning of the pain inward that mimics in a perverse and ineffective way repentance. It does seem to me that that's going on with a lot of the characters in Bergman's films. Now, once again, and my response is going to be similar to the response I gave to the last question, unless you've truly found the gospel, unless you've truly been moved by the Holy Spirit, how can you not engage in that sin? Right? How can you not let go of the despair? His characters, Kierkegaard, whom the one character in the film Saraband is reading, said in that famous line that Walker Percy loves so much, that the precise character of despair is this: not to know one is in despair. Right? Or the King Lear line, this is not the worst so long as we can say this is the worst. It does seem to me that there are possibilities, perhaps not for all of Bergman's characters, but for us as viewers, not us as believers, the wider range of viewers, that Bergman presents to us by making us aware of the despair in a universe where God's mercy is not present. Again, as opposed to the increasingly flippant way in which we confess publicly and demand forgiveness and act as if it's all gone like that, and then we're back doing it once again in the cycle of public confession. It strikes me that Bergman once again frames these things in a way that makes the issue impossible to resolve apart from real faith. Not that Bergman wants to make that move, but he keeps framing it in such a way that you can't resolve it unless you make that move.
I'm kind of curious, Professor Hibbs, whether you think there is a contemporary American equivalent that comes close to Bergman's depth or asks the sort of questions that he is asking.
Do you have someone in mind? I don't want to say.
I was going to propose the Coen brothers.
Wow.
Particularly in films like No Country would be perhaps an excellent choice for this sort of secular atheology, if you will.
Yeah, I thought Cormac McCarthy's book did that a little better than the film because the narrator's voice in the book is more prominent at the end than in the film. But, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there. That'd be another talk. So, okay. But I think I wouldn't disagree with that right off the top after saying, wow. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there. On this
well, I just want to bet with that answer, so thank you.
No, I don't have anyone else off the top of my head. Thank you. Last question.
I just offer a parting thought. The beauty of art is that it evokes in us memories, and your meditation on faces brought forth a line that I read earlier from Caritas and Veritate, one of the themes. And it is, in Christ, charity and truth becomes the face of his person, a vocation for us to love our brothers and sisters in the truth of his plan.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I think that what Bergman does with the face, and I think that's it is gloomy stuff. I mean, after working on this talk, I feel like I want to go watch Monty Python and listen to Jimmy Buffett for about 3 weeks. And I may do that starting in about 10 minutes if you'd like to join me. I hear David has margaritas out there. But I think that one of the things that I experienced watching Bergman, and especially watching a lot of things over again, is that, yeah, there is the bleakness, there is the unrelenting misery of many of the characters, but this attention, this deeply sympathetic attention to human faces and human voices and human silences raises the question what we're searching for in the face of another. And I think that those words from Benedict are the answer. Bergman raises that question in a way that I continue to be moved by, but not in such a way that he offers anything like that sort of response. Thank you.